a love that never crossed the line, but rewrote the sound of longing. She was Europe's finest pianist at 34. He was a 20-year-old unknown. Her husband was slipping into madness. What happened next lived between notes. In 1853, a shy prodigy named Johannes Brahms walked into the Schumann home in Düsseldorf. Clara Schumann, mother of 7, global star, and wife to the brilliant yet unraveling Robert, heard him play and felt the room tilt. Within months, tragedy hit. Robert's mind collapsed. Clara was barred from seeing him, and Brahms stepped in, not as a lover, but as a lifeline. Together, Clara and Johannes forged a devotion so precise it chose discipline over desire, and left its fingerprints on romantic music forever. Before we dive in, tap like so this story reaches more listeners, and subscribe for more untold histories that actually change how the music sounds when you hear it again. The year was 1853, and Clara Schumann, already a celebrated pianist across Europe, was navigating life in the shadow of personal and artistic loss. She was 34 years old, mother to 7 children, and the wife of Robert Schumann, one of the Romantic era's most brilliant composers. Yet Robert's mental health was failing rapidly. His spells of melancholy had deepened into bouts of paranoia and hallucinations. Clara, accustomed to performing to packed concert halls, now found herself balancing public triumph with private despair. It was in this fragile moment that a young man entered her life, a man whose genius was as raw and dazzling as his ambition. Johannes Brahms was just 20 years old when he arrived at the Schumann household in Düsseldorf, carrying under his arm a portfolio of manuscripts and a recommendation from violinist Joseph Joachim. He was, by all accounts, unknown, but from the first moment he sat at the piano, his playing revealed something undeniable, a kind of burning sincerity that leapt from his fingertips. Clara later wrote in her diary that the young man played us sonatas and scherzos of such beauty, so full of mastery, that we were speechless. Robert, impressed beyond measure, would soon hail Brahms as the savior of German music in a famous article titled Neue Bahnen, New Paths. But Clara's first impressions went beyond admiration for his talent. She noticed the shyness behind, his confident performance, the almost boyish awkwardness when he rose from the bench. For Brahms, the impact was equally immediate. Clara was not only a renowned artist, but a figure of grace and strength, qualities he had rarely encountered so vividly combined. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that made him instinctively protective, though she was more than capable of defending herself. She was a living embodiment of the music he loved, disciplined yet passionate, formal yet deeply human. Over the next months, Brahms became a constant presence in the Schumann home. He played duets with Clara, accompanied her in rehearsals, and discussed compositions with Robert late into the night. The house, once filled with the sound of Robert's latest work, now vibrated with a different kind of energy, the blending of Clara's elegance and Brahms' youthful fire. But under the surface, tension brewed. Robert's health declined, sharply, culminating in a suicide attempt in February 1854 when he leapt into the icy waters of the Rhine. Though he was rescued, the incident forced his admission to an asylum in Endenich. Clara, pregnant with their 8th child, was forbidden from visiting him for months. In this dark hour, Brahms stepped into a role that was both practical and intimate, caretaker, emotional anchor, and guardian of her household. What began as companionship deepened into something neither openly acknowledged. While Robert lived, any overt display of romantic affection would have been unthinkable. And yet, Their letters from this period reveal an intimacy of thought that went far beyond casual friendship. Brahms' words to Clara brimmed with tenderness. "I can do nothing but think of you. It is as though you were a precious work of art that I cannot let out of my sight." Clara, in turn, confided her innermost feelings about Robert's illness, her exhaustion, her fear of the future. She addressed him as "my beloved friend," a phrase that carried layers of meaning both of them understood, but never spoke aloud. Music became their safe space, a realm where emotions could be expressed without violating propriety. Brahms would compose pieces and bring them to Clara for her opinion. She would sight-read them, her fingers finding the voice he had poured into the score. Sometimes they played side by side for hours, speaking little, each lost in the intertwining melodies. It was during this time that Brahms composed some of his most tender piano works, pieces that Clara later said seemed to speak directly to my heart. She, in turn, found in his music a kind of solace she could not find elsewhere, a place where grief, love, and hope existed together without contradiction. Yet, for all their closeness, there was a line they would not cross, whether out of loyalty to Robert, fear of scandal, or the knowledge that a public romance could destroy them both. They maintained a formal distance in public. Friends and acquaintances whispered, but no proof ever surfaced. To the outside world, Brahms was the devoted protégé, and Clara the grieving wife, bound together by art and tragedy, nothing more. Still, there were moments, fleeting, stolen, that betrayed the depth of their connection. A glance held a second too long after, a duet, a lingering hand when exchanging sheet music, and in the privacy of their letters, an undercurrent of longing that history would never entirely decode. As 1854 turned to 1855, Robert's condition showed no sign of improving. Clara was finally allowed to visit him, but his mind was already slipping away. Brahms remained her steadfast ally, managing household affairs, shielding her from financial hardship, and offering a constant stream of encouragement. Yet even as they grew closer, the unresolved question of their relationship hung between them like an unfinished chord. Would they ever allow themselves to move beyond friendship? Or was the bond they shared destined to remain in the realm of music, wordless, profound, and forever incomplete? That question would only deepen as tragedy forced them to confront their feelings in ways neither had anticipated. By the spring of 1855, Clara's visits to Robert were tinged with sorrow. Each journey to the asylum in Endenich carried the faint hope of recognition, of a lucid conversation, of some return to the man she had married. But these hopes faded with each visit. Robert's letters, when he managed to write, were erratic, drifting between tender remembrances and incomprehensible fragments. His music, once a constant in their home, had fallen silent. During these long months, Brahms remained the steady presence she could depend upon. He helped oversee her concert arrangements, managed her correspondence when she was too weary, and ensured her children were clothed and fed. His role was practical, but also quietly intimate. In the quiet after the children had gone to bed, they would often sit together in the lamplight, she at her embroidery, he at the piano, sometimes exchanging only a few words before the night wore on. It was in such moments, the quiet in-between spaces of grief, that their attachment deepened. Brahms was acutely aware of the fragility of her position, a woman of stature and artistry, but still bound by the conventions of widowhood to come, not yet free to love openly. Clara, for her part, found in Brahms not only a friend, but someone who seemed to understand the full spectrum of her life, from the public performer to the private, often lonely, mother. Their letters from this period bear witness to an intensifying closeness. Brahms' words, though never explicitly romantic, carried an undercurrent of devotion. "I would gladly give up everything, if only I could see you happy." Clara, in turn, wrote of how his presence lightens the heaviness of my days and brings warmth into the cold corridors of my thoughts. Their shared work on musical projects became a safe conduit for emotions they could not openly declare. Brahms brought Clara his early piano concerto in D minor, a work of stormy passion and restless energy. She advised him on certain passages, praised others, and her annotations in his manuscripts survive. Delicate pencil marks that hint at evenings spent side by side over the score. It was, perhaps, in the music that they spoke most honestly. Clara's performances of Brahms' works were imbued with an intimacy that those in the audience could not entirely explain. Listeners heard something personal in the phrasing, a lingering on certain notes, a tenderness in quiet passages that seemed almost like a private conversation between pianist and composer. In 1856, a shift came. Brahms, aware of the increasing gossip surrounding his closeness to Clara, decided to leave Dusseldorf for a time. The decision was practical, to continue his own career to avoid scandal. But it was also an act of self-protection. The pull toward Clara was undeniable, yet the boundaries of propriety and their own unspoken restraint held firm. Clara's diary from that year speaks of a loneliness in the midst of company after Brahms's departure. She continued her concert tours, performing across Germany, Austria, and beyond. But there was a note of weariness in her entries. The applause no longer lifted her as it once had. The absence of a certain young composer's approving gaze seemed to dull the sparkle of her triumphs. By mid-1856, Robert's condition worsened dramatically. Clara, heavily burdened by both her touring schedule and the care of her children, received word that her husband's life was drawing to a close. She rushed to his side at the asylum, accompanied by Brahms, who had returned upon hearing the news. On July 29, 1856, Robert Schumann died. Clara was present, holding his hand, with Brahms nearby. The loss, though long anticipated, struck with a force that neither of them could have fully prepared for. In that moment, Clara was both a widow and a woman standing on the threshold of a new, uncertain chapter. In the weeks following Robert's death, Brahms became Clara's most trusted support. He helped her sort through Robert's papers, organized the transfer of musical manuscripts, and shielded her from unwanted public intrusions. Yet the shadow of grief was deep, and the propriety of the time still dictated that a widow's mourning should be both visible and prolonged. Their letters from this period reveal a strange duality. Moments of intense emotional connection, counterbalanced by a deliberate restraint. Brahms wrote, "I wish to be near you, yet I fear to overstep." Clara responded with gratitude for his unfailing kindness. But there is an unmistakable subtext, a yearning carefully hidden beneath formal language. Society's expectations were clear. Clara was to dedicate herself to her children, her late husband's musical legacy, and her own performances. Any romantic entanglement, especially so soon after Robert's death, would risk her reputation. For Brahms, the challenge was even more complex. He was aware that to openly declare himself would not only invite scandal, but might also tarnish Clara's standing in the musical world. And so they lived in a suspended state, bound by a love they could not name, navigating a public image that allowed them to remain in each other's lives without provoking condemnation. This balancing act was not without its cost. There were moments of withdrawal, even tension, when the closeness became too much to bear without resolution. Yet each time, they found their way back to one another, through letters, through music, through a shared understanding that needed no verbal acknowledgement. It was as though their love existed in a parallel key, not the dominant melody of their public lives, but a constant harmonic underpinning, shaping every note they played and every choice they made. By the end of 1856, both Clara and Brahms stood at a crossroads. The grief was still raw, the social constraints still rigid, but the bond between them had only deepened through shared loss. Would they step beyond the invisible boundary they had so carefully observed? Or would the very intensity of their feelings keep them locked in this state of longing, forever close, forever apart? The answer would unfold in the years to come, but for now, their love remained what it had always been, a quiet, powerful undercurrent, moving beneath the surface of history's grand events. In the months after Robert's death, life began to reassemble itself around Clara. She resumed concert tours with renewed intensity, partly for financial necessity, partly to keep grief at bay. The stage became her sanctuary, the one place where she could channel emotion into sound without fear of judgment. Yet always, Brahms lingered on the edges of her life. After a brief period away, he returned to Düsseldorf and later to Hamburg and Vienna, weaving himself once again into her orbit. The public explanation for his presence was simple: a close friend of the late Robert, a composer whose career Clara publicly supported. Privately, his visits rekindled the unspoken intimacy that had been their constant since those dark days of 1854. Their correspondence became the lifeline between their physical meetings. Brahms' letters were filled with fragments of his compositions, witty observations from his travels, and coded phrases that carried a deeper resonance only Clara would understand. Her replies, often delayed by her touring schedule, blended news of her children, reviews from her concerts, and reflections on the music he had sent. One particular exchange from the late 1850s hints at the push and pull of their relationship. Brahms teased her about a rival pianist who had praised her playing, writing, "He speaks of you as though you are an unattainable muse. I can't decide if I should correct him or agree entirely." Clara's reply, equally veiled, read, "Some muses, dear Johannes, remain just out of reach. It is what keeps the artist striving." As the years passed, they collaborated on numerous musical endeavors. Clara became one of the foremost interpreters of Brahms' works, championing his pieces on international stages. She premiered his piano concerto, performed his chamber works, and offered candid advice that he valued above all others. In turn, Brahms dedicated some of his most tender compositions to her, though never so directly that the world could read them as declarations of love. Music functioned as their shared language, capable of saying what they could not. In the lush second movement of Brahms' piano concerto in B-flat major, listeners heard a depth of feeling that seemed to belong to a world outside of concert halls, private, intimate, and aching with restraint. By the 1860s and 1870s, their lives had settled into a rhythm of intermittent meetings and constant correspondence. Brahms's career flourished, his symphonies and choral works earning him a place among the giants of romantic music. Clara's own renown as a pianist and teacher grew, and her interpretations of Robert's and Johannes's works became benchmarks for generations to follow. Yet beneath their public triumphs, the unresolved nature of their relationship endured. They spent holidays together on occasion, visited one another's homes, and took walks in quiet gardens, always within the limits imposed by their mutual sense of propriety. There were times when the strain of this lifelong restraint became apparent. In some letters, Brahms expressed frustration at his own inability to bridge the gap between friendship and romance. Clara, for her part, occasionally withdrew when she sensed public suspicion, or when the emotional closeness threatened to overwhelm. Her carefully maintained composure, but neither ever severed the bond entirely. Even in their most distant periods, Brahms would send scores for her review, and Clara would reply with honest, sometimes sharply critical, but always caring assessments. As the 19th century drew toward its end, age began to slow them both. Clara's hands, once capable of commanding the most demanding passages, grew stiff from decades of performance. Brahms, too, felt the weight of years, though he continued to compose prolifically. In their later meetings, there was less urgency, but perhaps more openness in their shared silences. Sitting side by side, they could speak without words, their long history woven into every pause, every glance. The passion of youth had given way to a profound mutual respect, and a love that was no less deep for having never been fully realized. In 1896, Clara's health declined sharply after a stroke. Brahms visited her in Frankfurt, where she lay bedridden, her speech slurred, but her eyes still bright when he entered the room. They spent hours together, speaking softly when they could, and simply sitting in silence when words failed. Clara died on May 20th, 1896. Brahms, devastated, attended her funeral. Friends noted that he seemed more frail than ever, as though her passing had taken some essential part of him. Less than a year later, on April 3rd, 1897, Johannes Brahms himself passed away, the two of them now joined only in memory. The world would remember Clara Schumann as one of the greatest pianists of her era, and Johannes Brahms as a towering composer, yet between their public legacies lies a quieter truth. Their lives were shaped by a bond that never needed formal acknowledgement to be real. In their music, they spoke to each other, and to us, across decades of longing, respect, and unfulfilled desire. Every delicate turn of phrase in Clara's interpretations, every aching melody in Brahms' works, carries the imprint of a love that lived outside the boundaries of convention. What does their story teach us? That love is not always measured by possession, nor is its value diminished by restraint. For Clara and Johannes, love was a lifelong act of presence, of showing up again and again, even when the world could not know the full truth. And so, though history may record their relationship as friendship, their music tells a different story. One of two souls who found in each other a lifelong harmony, even if they could never play the final resolving chord. Mexico City, 1928. The air smelled of wet earth after the summer rains, mingled with the pungent sweetness of marigolds from the street markets. In a small courtyard painted cobalt blue, a 21-year-old woman sat sketching on a wooden bench. Her dark hair was bound in ribbons. Her eyebrows nearly met above her gaze, and her smile, when it came, had the sharpness of defiance. Frida Kahlo was still recovering from the accident that had shattered her body 3 years earlier, when a streetcar collided with the bus she'd been riding. The injuries were catastrophic. Her spine fractured, pelvis crushed, right leg mangled. Her dreams of becoming a doctor were lost in that single violent moment. Bedridden for months, she had turned to painting as survival. By 1928, her canvases were unlike anything anyone had seen in Mexico. Bold, surreal, intimate, and unflinchingly honest, they blurred the lines between self-portrait and confession. And yet, though her art bore her strength, her body remained fragile, wrapped in corsets, haunted by pain, and yet unbowed. Across the city, another artist was shaping Mexico's identity on a monumental scale. Diego Rivera, 42 years old, was already a titan of the cultural Renaissance. Towering in size and reputation, he painted vast public murals that celebrated the struggles of workers, the vibrancy of indigenous heritage, and the promise of revolution. Rivera was magnetic, loud, opinionated, and endlessly charming. His personal life was infamous. He had married and divorced twice, left behind a trail of lovers, and fathered children he rarely raised. And yet, his genius drew admirers from every circle, from laborers to politicians. When Frida first saw his murals at the Ministry of Education, she was captivated, not by the man, but by the audacity of his work. Here was an artist who dared to make beauty political, who captured not merely faces, but entire struggles in brush strokes as sweeping as the country itself. Their first encounter was orchestrated by Frida herself. Carrying a few of her paintings, she sought out Diego while he was working on a mural at the headquarters of the Mexican Communist Party. She stood below the scaffolding and called up, her voice cutting through the din. "Señor Rivera, I've brought my paintings. I need to know if I should keep painting or if I'm wasting my time." Amused, Diego climbed down, wiping his hands on his paint-stained trousers. He examined her small, vibrant canvases, portraits that seemed to burn with private truths, and to her surprise, he took them seriously. "You have talent," he said finally, "and something rarer. You have courage. Keep painting." That moment marked the beginning of a connection neither of them could have anticipated. For Frida, Diego became not just an artistic mentor, but a force of gravity. For Diego, Frida's presence was like a sudden lightning strike. This young woman with the body of a convalescent, but the spirit of a revolution. Their relationship began with letters, studio visits, and endless arguments. They debated politics, art, fidelity, and the purpose of beauty. Diego, twice her age, treated her not as a protégé, but as an equal, a rarity in his world. Frida found herself drawn to his contradictions, the tenderness beneath his bluster, the idealism behind his cynicism, the discipline that allowed him to command walls while his personal life remained chaotic. Diego, in turn, was fascinated by her sharp wit, her irreverence, and her refusal to be overshadowed by anyone, not even him. It was not an easy love. Frida knew of his past, of his wandering affections. Friends warned her, "Diego is not made for fidelity." Her reply was characteristically direct. "Neither am I." In August 1929, they were married in a modest civil ceremony. The newspapers were merciless, calling them the elephant and the dove. Diego immense, Frida petite. Diego a public giant, Frida an emerging unknown. Her mother disapproved, considering Diego too old, too unfaithful, too impossible. But Frida was unmoved. In her diary she wrote, "I suffered 2 grave accidents in my life. One in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." Their home became a center of artistic and political life, hosting communists, poets, and revolutionaries. They painted side by side, argued late into the night, and lived with a ferocity that left little room for moderation. From the beginning, their art became a conversation. Diego's murals celebrated collective struggle. Masses of workers, fields of sugarcane, the rising sun of a socialist future. Frida's canvases, by contrast, turned inward, transforming her own suffering, desire, and identity into symbols that transcended autobiography. Yet, they influenced each other profoundly. Frida's palette brightened under Diego's encouragement. Diego, in turn, began to weave more intimate narratives into his sweeping compositions. Their studios were separated only by a small bridge connecting two adjoining houses, a literal embodiment of their lives. Close, intertwined, yet fiercely independent. But beneath the surface, fault lines were already forming. Diego's affairs, often shamelessly conducted, hurt Frida deeply, even as she claimed to expect them. Frida herself began to pursue her own relationships, with men and women alike, refusing to be diminished to the role of a suffering wife. Despite their turbulence, there was an undeniable magnetism neither could escape. They fought, separated, reunited, and fueled each other's work with an intensity that blurred the line between passion and destruction. For now, though, in those early years, there was still laughter in the courtyards, music from late night, gatherings, and a sense of being part of something larger than themselves, an artistic, political, and personal revolution. Would their love endure the betrayals to come? Or would the same passion that brought them together ultimately consume them both? By the early 1930s, the marriage of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera had already weathered storms. And yet, the real tempests were only beginning. Fame had come quickly for Diego. His murals had turned him into an icon of Mexico's cultural renaissance and a darling of American patrons eager to fund public art. In 1930, the couple moved to San Francisco, where Diego had been commissioned to paint at the San Francisco Stock Exchange. At first, their time in the US was intoxicating. They were celebrated as emissaries of Mexico's artistic rebirth. Frida, her Tijuana dresses, and unibrow-defying Western standards of femininity became an object of fascination in the bohemian circles they moved through. Yet, beneath the glittering receptions and commissions, Frida struggled with displacement. She disliked the stiff manners of wealthy American patrons, mocking what she called Gringolandia in letters to friends. While Diego thrived on admiration and opportunity, Frida's alienation deepened. The gap between them, in temperament, ambition, and fidelity, widened quietly at first, then catastrophically. In 1932, while in Detroit, Frida suffered a devastating miscarriage, one of several failed pregnancies that would haunt her life. Her physical pain was unbearable, but her emotional wounds cut deeper. She painted Henry Ford Hospital in the aftermath, a raw, surreal depiction of herself on a blood-stained bed, umbilical cords tethered to symbols of fertility, death, and mechanization. Diego, immersed in his Detroit industry murals, offered little comfort. Though he loved Frida deeply, his instinct was to throw himself into work, not grief. Frida felt abandoned, her sense of isolation sharpening into anger. In her diary, she wrote, "Diego was everything, my child, my lover, my universe, and yet he is never mine." Diego's affairs were no secret. From models to assistants, his wandering affections were part of his mythology, forgiven by some, excused by others, endured by Frida. But in 1934, his betrayal struck closer than ever before, an affair with Christina, Frida's younger sister. When Frida discovered the truth, her rage was volcanic. For weeks, she refused to see Diego, retreating into her studio at the Casa Azul. The paintings that emerged from this period were darker, sharper, suffused with symbols of dismemberment and revenge. In a few small nips, she depicted a bloodied, murdered woman, a brutal metaphor for her own sense of violation. Yet paradoxically, Frida also began asserting her independence more fiercely than ever. She took lovers of her own, men and women alike, among them photographer Nicolas Mouret and even later Leon Trotsky during his exile in Mexico. If Diego's infidelity had taught her that love could coexist with freedom, she would claim her share of both. In 1934, after returning to Mexico, Diego built them a pair of modernist houses in the San Angel district, two distinct homes connected by a single sky bridge. It was an architectural metaphor for their marriage, bound yet separate, connected yet free. Frida filled her house with vibrant colors, plants, and her ever-growing menagerie of pets, monkeys, parrots, and dogs. Diego's home was austere, functional, dominated by his studio space. The bridge between them became symbolic. They could cross when they wished, but each retained sovereignty over their private realms. Despite their personal turmoil, Frida and Diego's political ideals bound them tightly. Both were staunch communists, believing in art as an instrument of revolution. Their home became a sanctuary for exiles, thinkers, and radicals, the most famous being Leon Trotsky and his wife Natalia in 1937. Frida and Trotsky's brief affair was whispered about but never openly acknowledged within the household. Diego tolerated it, perhaps even expected it, though his pride bore the sting. For Frida, the liaison was less about passion than about reclaiming agency in a marriage where Diego's infidelities had long dictated the rules. Throughout this period, Frida's paintings grew bolder, more unflinchingly personal. In The Two Fridas, 1939, created during one of her separations from Diego, she painted two versions of herself seated side by side, one heart exposed and bleeding, dressed in European lace, the other vibrant in traditional Mexican attire, heart intact. The work was a visual dialogue between abandonment and self-possession, between pain and pride. Diego, meanwhile, continued to dominate walls with his colossal murals, but even his work began to absorb private undertones. In some panels, subtle figures, women with Frida's features, crept into the sprawling narratives, quiet nods to the woman who haunted his life and art. By 1939, their marriage had reached a breaking point. The affair with Cristina had never fully healed, and their constant quarrels had worn them both thin. They divorced that November, an act that shocked Mexico's artistic and political circles. Frida, always defiant, embraced her independence publicly. She cut her hair short, wearing suits instead of dresses, and painted self-portrait with cropped hair, herself seated solemnly in Diego's oversized clothes, scissors in hand, strands of hair strewn across the floor. Above her, she inscribed lyrics from a popular song. "Look, if I loved you, it was for your hair. Now you're bald. I don't love you anymore." But beneath the performance of liberation, her longing for Diego never truly subsided. Even in separation, Frida and Diego were never entirely apart. He visited the Casa Azul often. She attended his exhibitions. They exchanged letters that oscillated between tenderness and reproach. Friends described their bond as volcanic, impossible to extinguish, no matter how often it erupted. In 1940, less than a year after their divorce, they remarried. Frida set conditions this time: no physical intimacy, separate finances, and separate lives under one roof. Diego agreed, knowing he could not live without her near, even if their union defied convention. Their remarriage marked not a resolution, but a renewal of complexity. A partnership sustained as much by shared ideals and artistic kinship as by passion. But the years ahead would bring new challenges. Frida's declining health, Diego's relentless affairs, and the looming shadow of mortality. Would their love survive when Frida's body began to fail her completely? Or would the art they left behind become the truest testament to a bond too wild for any simple ending? By the early 1940s, Frida's health began to collapse under the weight of her lifelong injuries. Her spinal surgeries multiplied, her right leg weakened further, and she endured relentless infections. Yet even as her body betrayed her, her spirit sharpened. Pain for Frida became another palette, each brushstroke soaked in blood, longing, and defiance. The Casa Azul in Coyoacán transformed into both sanctuary and prison. Bedridden for weeks at a time, she propped up a mirror above her bed so she could paint self-portraits without rising. "I paint myself," she once said, "because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Diego, by contrast, remained a force of motion, working on massive commissions, lecturing, taking lovers. Yet when Frida's suffering grew acute, he always returned. He arranged doctors, paid for treatments, sat by her bedside when fever consumed her. Their marriage, unconventional as ever, oscillated between distance and tenderness, a rhythm as irregular as Frida's faltering heartbeat. After remarrying in 1940, their union softened into something quieter than passion, but no less profound. They had accepted each other's infidelities, recognized the impossibility of demanding monogamy from one another, and found a strange peace in the truth of their natures. Still, Frida's insecurities never fully healed. She once wrote in her diary, "Diego, my love, my child, my mirror, I don't love you like a woman loves a man. I love you with all my being, as if you were not only you, but also myself." Their love had become something larger than possession, a merging of identity and creation. Where Diego painted Mexico's people, Frida painted her own soul. Together, they crafted an artistic dialogue that transcended even their most bitter quarrels. The 1940s also deepened their shared role as political figures. They hosted radical thinkers, writers, and revolutionaries at the Casa Azul, making it a nexus of artistic and ideological exchange. Mexico, freshly asserting its cultural identity on the world stage, embraced Frida and Diego as embodiments of its spirit, earthy, vibrant, contradictory, and unyielding. Frida became increasingly outspoken in her own right. Her art, once dismissed as personal and secondary to Diego's grand murals, began to find international recognition. Exhibitions in New York and Paris brought her acclaim. Though critics struggled to categorize her work, surrealists claimed her. Frida rejected the label. "I never paint dreams," she insisted. "I paint my own reality." In 1953, gangrene forced doctors to amputate Frida's right leg below the knee. For a woman who had already endured so much physical trauma, this was a cruel blow. Yet her response, in typical Frida fashion, was both despairing and defiant. She painted prosthetic boots adorned with flowers, dressing them like altars. She joked bitterly to friends, "I used to think I'd lost my virginity at 6, but now I've truly lost a part of myself." Diego stayed near during her recovery, hovering like a restless guardian. Still, she sensed the limits of his presence. He loved her, yes, but she would always be one of many gravitational pulls in Diego Rivera's chaotic orbit. That same year, despite her declining health, Frida insisted on attending the opening of her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a milestone she had awaited for decades. Doctors warned her not to go, but she arrived anyway, carried on a stretcher, and laid upon a 4-poster bed set up in the gallery. Guests wept and applauded as she toasted from her pillows, laughing loudly, cigarette in hand, swathed in embroidered Tijuana dresses that masked her frailty. "I am not sick," she declared that night. "I am broken, but I am happy to be alive as long as I can paint." Diego watched her that evening with a rare stillness, later writing, "Frida is the most important fact of my life. Loving her has been the most wonderful and most painful thing that has ever happened to me." By 1954, Frida's lungs had weakened, her strength dwindled, and bouts of pneumonia kept her bedridden. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the Casa Azul. Officially, the cause was pulmonary embolism, though whispers of a deliberate overdose persisted, fueled by her final diary entry. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Diego was inconsolable. Though their life together had been turbulent, he confessed to friends that he had loved her more than anyone or anything. "Too late," he said. "I realized the most wonderful part of my life was my love for Frida." Diego survived her by just 3 years. In that time, he wandered from commission to commission, painting walls that now seemed haunted by her absence. He remarried, but by his own admission, "Frida never left me." He died in 1957, his ashes interred in Mexico City's Rotunda of Illustrious Persons, while Frida's remain at the Casa Azul in an urn shaped like a toad, his nickname for her. The love of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera was not gentle. It was volcanic, erupting in betrayal, separation, reconciliation, and constant reinvention. Yet its violence birthed some of the 20th century's most enduring art. In Diego's sweeping murals, Frida's presence lingers in quiet corners, woven into Mexico's collective identity. In Frida's searing self-portraits, Diego appears again and again, sometimes as a third eye on her forehead, sometimes as a tiny figure held in her hand, sometimes as a wound carved into her heart. Their love, like their art, defied rules. It was neither wholly destructive nor wholly redemptive. It simply was, immense, imperfect, and unforgettable. What remains of Frida and Diego is not a tidy narrative, but fragments stitched together by passion and paint, letters smeared with longing, canvases dripping with grief and joy, murals proclaiming revolutions that were both political and personal. Some loves are steady flames. Theirs was lightning, dazzling, dangerous, impossible to hold, yet illuminating everything it touched. Their promise wasn't to behave, it was to make work that outlived the wreckage. The murals stayed, the portraits stare back. The argument is still hanging on the wall. Tap like, subscribe, and share this with someone who thinks love has to be tidy to be true. New episodes weekly.